According to this approach, we're not interested in talking about how we wandered in the desert. We're not interested in talking about even the splitting of the sea, which the Rambam leaves out from his Hagaddah. We're not interested in talking about coming to the land of Israel. That's way too far. We're not even interested in that which comes just 50 days later, the story of the standing at Mount Sinai. We're not interested. We have one focus tonight. What happened tonight? Man shtana halayla hazeh. Why is this night different? That's the question. And the answer needs to stay on that point. How is this night special? And on this night, we didn't go to Israel. On this night, we went out of Egypt. And Dayenu, that's enough. That's our focus tonight, is to speak about how we went out of Egypt. Nothing else. That's one approach. One approach is that there's nothing missing from the Hagaddah. And when we go back to the land of Israel one day, or for those of us or those of you who live in the land of Israel, you need not change your Hagaddah. This Hagaddah is not an exilic Hagaddah. This Hagaddah is perfect. It's talking to the child about the moment in which you sit. It's about tonight. And tonight, we went out of Egypt. We didn't get to Israel yet. We didn't get to Sinai or the splitting of the sea. Tonight is the night to talk about nothing else but tonight. That's one approach. There is another approach, and strangely enough, it's also found in that very Rambam himself. The Rambam goes through the laws of the Seder, talks a lot about the exact contents of the Hagaddah, but then he says, look, you might want to know exactly what are the words of the Hagaddah. What is my version of the Hagaddah? Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, what are you supposed to say? He says, don't worry, I'll put an appendix at the end, and I'll tell you what to say. In the introduction to that appendix, he says as follows. Nosach Hagaddah shenagu ba Yisrael. The text of the Hagaddah, the version which is customary among Israel, bizman hagalut kachu. In the time of exile, this is the Hagaddah. According to this passage in the Rambam, the notion that we leave out the land of Israel from our Hagaddah may be a reflection that this is an exilic Hagaddah. The Hagaddah of redemption, the Hagaddah which we'll have one day in the land of Israel, after the building of the temple, that will not be the same Hagaddah as this. There it would be appropriate, it would be recommended that we would mention also the coming to the land of Israel. Maybe we'll bring back all those verses that were left out. Because when we come to the land of Israel, then it would be appropriate to tell the story in a fuller sense. What are we saying? We're saying that maybe as a child asks us a question, how is tonight different? You have to be careful. If you say, well, we went out of Egypt, and in Egypt we were not free, and we came out, and we went to the land of Israel, and you know where we are today? Sorry about that, we're back where we started again. We're back in Egypt again. Especially for Maimonides, he lived in Egypt. We're back in the land, the USSA. That's where we're back. So then how does the story make sense? Where exactly was the great salvation? How do we get out from point A to point B? Seems to me we came back to point A again. In exile. Telling the story of going to the land of Israel is a real downer. It's something that ruins the whole story. Second theory as to why we have a missing piece from the Hagaddah is because the Maggid would be ruined by mentioning the coming to Israel, because Israel is not a place where unfortunately, I'm not there. And since I'm not there, I can't tell my child with a straight face that we're happy about coming out of Egypt to go to Israel. So we need to focus on coming out of Israel in those days, and in how each of us in our own times comes out of our own personal Egypt. That's it. We're not going to mention the land of Israel. There is some indication in the Talmud that in fact some rabbis thought that it was necessary to mention the land of Israel in the Hagaddah, and in some very strange way we do acknowledge this point. Firstly, the Mishnah says that when you tell the story, you tell that story of Laban, the wandering Aramean, from Parshat Kitavo, from the bringer of the first fruits, the Laban the wandering Aramean, you say that and ad sheyigmor kol parsha kula. You've got to finish that story. Don't stop in the middle. Keep going. Go to the end of that story. Tell them you came to this place and you've been given the land flowing with milk and honey. That's what the Mishnah says. We just may not do it because we're in exile. Also, Rava, who did live in exile, one of the great sages of the Talmud, he says, you've got to mention that he took us out in order to bring us to the land which he promised us. You've got to mention that verse we began with from the first Hagaddah, the first story, that God brought us out in order to bring us to the land which he promised our forefathers. So there is such a possibility, and in fact we do mention that verse later on in the Hagaddah, in the section after Rabbi Gamliel. So there is a possibility that without mentioning Israel, we don't fulfill the mitzvah, or that the mitzvah is incomplete without it. What are the 4 ways in which Israel could have been included in the Hagaddah? Could have been included as part of the original story, that we went from Egypt, splitting the sea, Sinai, and to the land of Israel. Could have been included as my story. I personally was in Egypt. I was then in Israel, and maybe for some of you, for some people today, you can say they're there now. They're still there in the land of Israel. It could be part of the future story. We were in Israel. We're not there now, but L'Shana Ha'ba'ah, next year, we'll be there, Ba'arab Yisrael, in the land of Israel. And fourthly, Israel could be included as part of the notion that this year I didn't eat the Paschal lamb, but next year I'll fulfill that aspect of it as well. 4 ways in which Israel could be included. What's the message? What's the message of the missing piece of the Hagaddah? The message is, focus on what you have. Focus on the redemptions that you do have. Focus on the redemptions you can grasp your arms around and say, thank you, God, for this redemption. Don't pine away. Don't cry about that which is incomplete from the redemption. Don't complain that it's only the Atchalta de Geula, only the beginning of the redemption. Focus on the redemption that you do have. On Pesach, we have a uni-focus. It's the redemption. Yes, a day after Pesach, we'll start counting toward Mount Sinai, toward Shavuos, toward the next holiday. We're not there yet. We have one full day on which we focus solely and exclusively on the fact that we went out of Egypt, on this night. As the Sfas Emes says, it's worthy to focus on every single mitzvah. Kedayu lahatos lavinu elav yisparach. When we have just one miracle, it's worth focusing on. It's worth focusing on the good things we have in life. Pesach is about going away from bad. We're not ready to go to good yet, to go to Sinai. Just getting away from Egypt, that's enough. Dayinu. I hope that on this Pesach, we'll be able to have that focus on that which is good in life, that which is fixed, that which doesn't need any fixing. That's what we wish everyone for this Pesach. We thank you for joining us today. And on Chol Moed Pesach, on the next Monday, Mirz Hashem, we'll gather again here at stickcam.com, stickcam.com, stickcam.com/Anshe, where you can watch our broadcast live, or you can go to youtube.com/AsbyMemphis, and you can join us there. I want to thank Jason Lefkowitz for putting this production together today from the JSL studios. I'd like to remind everyone that the Birkas Hachama, the blessing of the sun, is this Wednesday morning. We'll be davening in the morning at 6:45. 7:20 we'll make that bracha. Then we'll gather for a siyum, for a completion of a tractate, with a breakfast as well, sponsored by the Joffreys. Our topic for next week will be the meaning of Chol HaMoed, sources and the meaning of Chol HaMoed. And the next time we meet after that, we'll be speaking about a unifying theory about the tsaras, about leprosy. what it's all about, getting in touch with the true you. Thank you for joining us today, and have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy and healthy Pesach.